Welcome back to Our Issues Milwaukee. I'm your host, Andrea Williams. If you're just joining us, we're being joined by Dr. Erin Winkler. She's an associate professor of African and African diaspora studies at UW Milwaukee. She shared with us information on how to talk to children about race and racism and her contributions to the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture located on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. Welcome back.
Thank you.
And recent headlines remind us that racism remains a problem in America. And I'll just tell you, I am one of those people who was guilty of thinking once former President Barack Obama was elected that we were moving our way into a post-racial society. And yeah, I was obviously wrong, but as an expert on how children learn about race, research shows that kids learn about racism in discussing enslavement and the civil rights movement, which you did mention earlier, but you feel that it's important to make those connections to things that are going on today. So if you look at a Colin Kaepernick, or you look at police brutality and things of that nature, a child who was innocently shot while sitting in their home, you know, all of these things are important, because even if you're watching the news and something upsets you and you don't talk about it, but your child witnesses you're being upset, you're kind of leaving them kind of hanging because they sometimes get confused or don't know what to think, right?
That's right. And you're not teaching them that race or issues of race don't matter. They see they matter very much. What we're teaching them is to be silent about them and not to talk. So I think what you're saying about connecting to the present moment is really important, because what research shows is that if we only teach them about historical racism, then first of all, they often think the problem is solved, that it was solved by the civil rights movement, and therefore when they see remaining inequities, they tend to blame those on the communities themselves, as opposed to understanding how those connect to those historical experiences of racism. But the other thing is if we only teach children how to recognize one kind of racism, in other words, this sort of pre-civil rights, open, obvious, hatred towards groups that is written into the law and legal, if we only teach them to recognize that form of racism, then that is the only form of racism that they'll be able to recognize. The problem with that is that in the contemporary moment, racism and racial inequity has morphed and is taking on different forms that are often less open, less obvious, not written into law, but still practiced in fact.
Yeah, and so I read this very interesting article that was talking about racial microaggressions. And so in talking about, you know, modern times, microaggressions are described as brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative slights and insults towards people of color. And there's all these little stair steps under the umbrella that happen to people each and every day. And so in understanding that these things happen, it causes conversation to happen at the water cooler, I think, when we see different things take place in the headlines. So most recently, and there's so many things, it's really unbelievable to me, but there's the governor of Virginia and Virginia's attorney general that both admitted to wearing blackface decades ago. And what I found in this happening, that there are a lot of older people, you know, who weren't necessarily around when minstrel shows were taking place, but they don't quite understand why that's so offensive to people of color.
Younger people too.
Oh, and we don't expect young people too, but we expect people of certain age to understand, but there are a lot of people who are kind of in the dark.
That's right, yes. So you raised a really good point here about how this can be intentional or unintentional. I think in our society we focus so much on whether or not we intended something to be hurtful or racist, and if we didn't intend it, we think, well, that's the answer, that's off the hook.
Yeah.
We are off the hook. But really we need to focus on the outcome. What is changes the outcome. And so I did have maybe 10 years ago, I had a white mother in the area email me and say, that her white high school son had dressed up for Halloween as an African-American figure that he admired, and he was told that was racist because he had used face makeup, and he didn't understand why that was offensive, and neither did she. She was seeking answers, and so I think a lot of people don't know about this history. Blackface really started in the United States around the late 1820s, early 1830s, and the reason I highlight that time period is very important because it's right when, not coincidentally, the abolitionist movement is really picking up speed. So the movement to abolish or end slavery is really picking up speed. Well, the practice of blackface, and like you said, often called minstrel shows, would be white men putting black makeup on their face, exaggerating their lips, making them wider, exaggerating their eyes, exaggerating their features, and performing in a way that's dehumanizing to African Americans, that portrays African Americans as unintelligent, simple, less than
perpetuate
human.
Stereotypes, all of those things.
Exactly. And so this was a way to try to justify enslavement, to try to say these people can't handle freedom. And so people think, people in our contemporary moment may think, well, this is just putting on makeup. But in fact, the history of blackface, it was invented and used to dehumanize black people. If I can say one more thing about that, even after the end of enslavement, people may have heard of the film The Birth of a Nation that came out in 1915, also white actors in blackface. But now, after the end of enslavement, instead of portraying sort of a happy, simple person, they're portraying African Americans as violent, dangerous brutes who want to rape white women. And so, again, it's meant to sort of justify racial violence against African Americans and racial oppression, whether it was enslavement under enslavement or later, 1915, here's where we're seeing the rise of lynching and other kinds of racialized violence.
Yes, and you summarized that very well. And, and it's hurtful. When you look back, it's almost, I don't know, it's breathtaking to me that this all took place and that it was used to also, not only kind of put out those negative stereotypes and all the things that you said, but also just to entertain other white people,
That's right.
So that's why, in a nutshell, it's very offensive in this day and age. And then so we look at luxury designers, Gucci. They apologized for selling a knit sweater that depicted a black face. Prada was criticized for a Sambo figurine that connected to purses. They also said that that was not done purposely. And then most recently, Burberry, they apologized for a runway look. It was a beige hoodie, and instead of the normal strings, there were these thick ropes that were tied into a noose. And so it's like, why does this keep happening? And is it intentional or unintentional? But regardless, it is still offensive because it's taking us right back to the things we just talked about.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question of whether or not it's intentional is interesting, but it's sort of in the end doesn't change the outcome. The outcome is we continue to see images that tie to this dehumanization of people of African descent. And so the outcome is perpetuating, the dehumanization of Black lives, whether or not it was intentional. Why does it keep happening? I mean, I think there are multiple reasons for that, but I do think that one reason is that we don't teach Black history in K through 12 education. We occasionally teach it in college, but I can't tell you how many times I've had students angry, upset, and they feel cheated that they didn't learn any of these things until college, and even then maybe
I was one of those students.
That's right.
Yeah.
And then maybe
it was Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, two outstanding figures, but that's all that they taught you, and that's really what really prompted me to go to a historically Black college and university to just really have a better understanding of who I am, where I came from, and what and how many awesome individuals contributed to so many things that help make America what it is today.
And that shouldn't depend on whether or not one goes to college. We should be teaching that from the time children are in preschool.
I totally agree.
And really getting at some of these complicated issues, and not only for African American students. I can't tell you how many times I've had teachers or educators say to me, like, well, it's not really an issue here because I have an all-white class. Well, then it's even more of an issue in many ways, because they may not have people in their homes and communities who can teach them some of these things as well. So
it is about having an appreciation for all of the different cultures, like I said, that have contributed to what we call America. Absolutely.
And may I say one more thing about the designers, why I think it keeps happening. I think a lot of it has to do with diversity in these industries.
Oh, yeah.
So when I see those things, I say, how many people had to sign off on that before that went to market, before that went down the runway?
Before it hit social media and it's like too late.
It would only take one person with the knowledge to say, I don't think this is quite right. And so that makes me think about the importance of, you know, that kind of diversity in all industries.
I totally agree. And before we run out of time, I wanted to bring up a recent poll that was conducted by the Pew Research Center. It revealed that 1 out of 3 Americans, that's 34%, say that blackface is always or sometimes acceptable as part of a Halloween costume. And it also asked if it was acceptable to wear traditional dress from a country or culture other than their own as part of a Halloween costume. 58% of Americans said that that was are always or sometimes acceptable. So we've got a lot of teaching or a lot of understanding to do.
Yes, that's right.
Wow. So just really want to take a moment to thank you for coming by and having this conversation. I think these type of conversations are important, and I hope that whoever's watching at home is able to take away something to prompt them to maybe Google and look further into some historical scenario or some current day scenario as well. But this conversation, I'm hoping, will prompt them to at least talk to their children about race and racism, if nothing else.
I agree. Thank you so much.
It has been a pleasure. Thank you. Dr. Erin Winkler is an associate professor of African and African diaspora studies at UW Milwaukee. She's also the author of the book Learning Race, Learning Place, Shaping Racial Identities and Ideas in African American Childhoods. As we wrap up Black History Month, we'll end today's show with a reminder that there are only 2 races, the human race and the race we must run. That's going to do it for today's show. I'm your host, Andrea Williams. As always, thank you for watching, and I do hope you join us next week as we take another look at our issues Milwaukee. Have a great day.